Good morning all, and thank you very much for attending this Executive Advisory Panel for Prosperous Communities here today on Wednesday the 8th of November 2023. If I could just first of all remind all members that this EAP is being live streamed on YouTube as we speak. So I do also welcome anybody who has joined us from the public on YouTube. First item on the agenda, apologies for absence. I'm not aware of any apologies. Are there any? I think we're all...
The only apology received is from David Watts, Chair.
Thank you very much. So moving on, item number 2. Are there any members' declarations of interest? Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Moving on, item number 3, the Housing Services Update. I will hand over to my co-chair.
Thanks for that. So we've got the Housing Services Update, which, Yvonne, I believe you're doing a presentation for us.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to EAP today. My name's Yvonne Coleman-Thomas. I'm the Assistant Director for Housing. I thought it would be helpful, as I've now been here 6 months, having had the privilege of joining you in April 2023, to just take you through some of the issues that we face within housing, how the sector is for us, some of key performance, some of my priorities for housing going forward, and also the team that manages those services, and to just give you also some context in terms of some of the wider sector issues that are happening. So I just have a presentation to go through with you. Quite a few slides, but I think they're all good and informative, and will help give you some context into my role and what I do. So once again, I'm the Assistant Director. My portfolio covers strategic housing, development and property services. And predominantly the headline teams are the homeless prevention team. So I have homelessness allocations, we manage the keyways allocations, and we also support rough sleepers and manage any homeless families that are in temporary accommodation. I also have the housing and the tenancy team, so that's all of the teams that support our residents who are living in our over 8,000 council tenancies, but also our leasehold services. And we also manage the estates and the surrounding areas, but we also manage income collection, helping residents maximise their income and have a financial inclusion team. And I also am responsible for sheltered housing and support services. The next one, obviously of priority for many of our residents, is repairs and maintenance. So the repairs and maintenance teams covers day-to-day repairs, what we would call responsive repairs. A resident calls, we respond to that inquiry. We also have emergency repairs. We support residents with aids and adaptations, but we also do cyclical work. So that will be improvements to roofs, windows, and other large compact areas, and particularly compliance. So I'm also responsible for fire safety, and in terms of the compliance, that includes gas, Legionella, electricity, water, and all of those building safety compliance issues that work to keep our residents safe. The next part of the role that I have is development and enabling, so looking at the areas and pockets of land where we can develop, whether that's through building ourselves, working with a development partner, or converting some existing properties that we have. But a key role in terms of being a wider partner to that is working as an enabler. NNC, as the local authority, also has a responsibility through its planning to enable developers to come into the areas and build properties and build our communities, making sure that we're building properties of the good standard and in the right areas. And part of that role as well is working with the private sector housing in terms of supporting how we can manage temporary accommodation. And I'm also responsible for all housing policy procedures and strategy. My portfolio holder is Councillor Mark Rowley, who's here as co-chair today. And Mark is the exec member leader for housing communities and levelling up. I would also like to put out a thank you to Councillor Matt Binley, who on joining was my first portfolio holder. So thank you to both for the support, advice and guidance I've received since I've joined here at NNC. I'm supported by a team of 4 strategic leads. So my housing team is Dan Hannum, who's responsible for property services, Leona Keeble, Leona Mantle, who's responsible for housing and tenancy services, Carly Hone is responsible for housing solutions, which is homelessness, housing allocations, rough sleeping, and also Lee Smith, who's responsible for development and enabling services. So I thought it'd be helpful to just give you some key areas of where there are some issues that influence the sector, not only just here at NNC, but in the wider context. So first of all, building safety and compliance, very much an issue for us, but also heightened by the tragedy we had at Grenfell, and a raft of additional legislation that came into place there. And as I've mentioned, we look at fire safety, building regulations, gas, heating, electric, water, Legionella. There's new legislation coming out all of the time that we need to keep on top of. So we make sure that we procure the right contracts, so we have gas contracts and maintenance contracts in place so that we can assure that we are fully compliant and we're keeping residents safe within their properties. The big one, the cost of living crisis, impacting not only our residents but everybody within NNC. We've seen on the telly almost every day the changes to the interest rates, the economic climate. People are finding it really difficult to find paid employment. Watching an article this morning where a lady was saying, she earns £1,200, but actually childcare is £1,100. It's not viable for her to work. In that as well, we are seeing many people who are being evicted because they're no longer able to afford rent, and that's putting additional pressures on the local authority in terms of supporting those families with temporary accommodation. We'll see even private landlords increase their rents, also some of that to manage the increase that they are seeing with their own mortgages. But we are seeing a number of increases in repossessions from residents and owners who are no longer able to actually afford their own mortgages. Impacting on that as well is often residents' ability to actually be able to pay their rent. You may be aware that the rents that we receive and the service charges that we receive, they are ring-fenced, they're protected, and we call that the housing revenue account. It's a protective sum of money, and that money pays for all of the services that we deliver within housing. So any impact on us being able to maximise rental income can have a negative impact on our ability to run the service. I've spoken about the raft of regulation, but it isn't just about building safety. There's a lot of regulation about how we engage with our residents. So we have green papers and white papers that look at how we are engaging with our residents and giving residents a voice and empowering and enabling them to take a view, a decision, and influence the housing service that they deliver. And recently we have a new regulator, so we have not only the Housing Ombudsman, but we have the regulator for social housing, and also there's new regulation around tenant services measures. So these are KPIs, key performance indicators around our performance that we will be required to report and monitor the regulator. And that looks not only around how we are delivering the service, but how we are responding to residents' complaints, repairs services, a number of voids, standards of voids, so actually lots. The newest thing that's coming into the sector, and this will be applicable to us from April 2024, is the new requirement that those that provide a service are responsible for and deliver a housing service now become professionally qualified. Our professional body is the Chartered Institute of Housing. A number of us are registered to that. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Housing. I've had the privilege of being that for some 15 years now. And the Institute of Housing is looking to bring the professional standards up and to make us perhaps compliant with the Law Society or, the RICS. So we will be requiring, it's now a mandatory law, it comes into place in April 2024, for all staff that deliver those services will be required to have a professional qualification. And that now means that current staff will have to be taken through that process, but also any new staff applying to us. I think that's excellent. I think that we should be more of a professional body and recognised and monitored, and it's good development and experience for our staff to be through. I know that Lynn, Councillor Buckingham, is very much an advocate for the professional standards and supporting of the Chartered Institute of Housing. So we will be navigating our way through that over the next 18 to 24 months. Interestingly, the government, whilst requiring us to do that, has not provided us with any additional funding to be able to train staff through that qualification. And it will also give us a comparative to our social workers who sit within adult social care, who have to have that social work qualification. So something I very, very, very much support. Homelessness, as I've mentioned, homelessness, we are seeing a massive increase in people that are approaching us for homelessness. As a council, we have a legal and many would say a moral duty to support our residents who are either at risk of homelessness or are homeless or are sleeping rough. The major legislation that covers that and governs that is the Housing Act, but also the Homeless Reduction Act. And that expanded a number of years ago to not only providing support, but also to provide advice and guidance. Not everybody that applies to us as homeless we will be deemed to have a duty to, but we would be required to offer them advice and guidance to help them mitigate their risk and the risk of them becoming homeless, or support those on the streets. I'm sure we've heard recently the controversy of a comment about people choosing a lifestyle to be rough sleepers. I would say in my experience of housing, that's not necessarily a choice that many residents and those that sleep rough would take. Many of our people that are rough sleeping do have mental health, alcohol and drug related issues, and many of the factors around homelessness can be a breakdown of relationship, domestic abuse. We saw within COVID that also we had an increase in homelessness because a lot of tied accommodation, so those people that were working in hotels or pubs where they had accommodation as part of their employment, when those organisations, companies closed down, there was an increase in people that were homeless. But also there's a lot of legislation around planning and development. And one of the things we probably need to be more agile at is using the planning and the development opportunities and legislation to us to build more affordable quality houses in the right areas and wider communities. Understanding that most of our properties are in Corby and Kettering, but NNC is a wider borough, and we should be looking to build more properties and provide developers with the option to choose. And most importantly, holding to the Section 106 agreement, which will require them to deliver a percentage of affordable housing within our borough if they do choose to come within the borough. So I thought it'd be helpful to just take you through a number of key stats in terms of what I look at and some of the services that do deliver. So just as an idea, we have around 8,000 properties split. Although we are one at NNC, still historically 4,500 within the Corby area and approximately 3,500 within Kettering. Thought it would also be interesting to advise you that most of our stock is built within the 1945 and the 1964 area. So quite a lot of our stock is older and is starting to require more and more improvements and modernisations to bring them up to standard and to ensure that they remain safe and resident and suitable for our residents to live within. In the first 6 months of this year, NSC has let 268 new council tenancies. That's a 41% increase in the same period of last year. And we get properties back for various reasons, sadly on the death of a resident, maybe a resident's moved to another area, perhaps they've swapped into other places, perhaps the property isn't suitable. Our current target, and this is just to give you a year-on indication of our target, is our day-to-day normal, what we would call normal voids. We have a turnaround time of 56 days. By normal voids, we mean not those that need major work, so, you know, new central heating boilers, windows, electrics, all of those. They come out as major works. So as you can see, since April, we've come down from 62 days, just around the 54 day, I think, would be the collaborative average. But actually, as an actual total, we are currently under the 56-day target, and we're at 51.6 days. So I think a lot of work has been to make sure we're returning our properties around to a good standard so that we can get residents into their homes, in there. And whilst we call these voids, we should be clear, voids is a technical term, but these are our residents' homes. So as you would have been aware, I think because of COVID, there had been a backlog of repairs, and there was, I think just shortly after I joined, a commitment to provide us with additional funding to cover the backlog of repairs. We started in March with a backlog of just over 5,500 properties, backlog repairs that needed to be completed. As of September, we are now down to 2,856. We've brought in a dedicated team to be able to help us to do that, and we've piloted blitzing on particular areas so that we can go in and do all the repairs in one area. To target, we should have been approximately at 50% of completion of those backlog at this time. We are at 48%, so just 2% off. Some of that is because actually we've had to go back in and do some of those works if a resident hasn't been available, and obviously we'll have operatives having annual leave. But I'm very, very confident that we will be on target to achieve that over by the end of the financial year. So certainly on target to hit that target and deliverability in terms of the backlog of the repairs completed. I mentioned earlier that part of the role of the repairs team is not just the responsive repairs, but we're also responsible for emergency repairs. And up until September, we had just under 500 emergency repairs reported to us. All of those repairs were completed. And we had a nominal gap in those that were complete in time. But I think if you look at the last table in September, you will see the number that came, the number that completed, and only a small number of percentages weren't completed within time, but all 500 were completed in terms of our emergency repairs. Also, obviously mentioned that we are responsible for homeless, and I thought this was a really good table to give you to look at the difference in the level of approaches that we have received. So the grey total columns that you see are the homelessness approaches that we had in 22-23. I think you can see straight away in April 2023 that the approaches had risen from 297 to 413. We are seeing an increase in trajectory of homelessness approaches to us. We've topped out at 539 during June. We often see an increase between the June and July, and we will see an increase between January, February, March after the Christmas period. And you will see, if you look at the grey column in January 2024, that's our that was last year, the grey, we had 551 and 581 approaches last year, and we do expect to see that trajectory increase. So that's placing a much bigger demand in terms of the housing service and the advice and the guidance and the support that we have to give. And where we do accept a duty, we often are having to provide people with temporary accommodation. But that obviously has an impact in terms of cost as well. So homelessness isn't going away, and we are seeing an increase in demand. One of the things that we want to start doing is front-loading that support so that we can support people who are in accommodation who are at risk of homelessness and providing them with guidance and advice, and certainly supporting our landlords within the private sector to actually not be able to evict people. Yesterday in the King's speech, there was additional legislation that's come in that will help hopefully provide some protection and help residents in terms of not being evicted through no-fault evictions by their landlord. So I've mentioned that whilst we have many, many approaches, we also have a duty. And this is a table that charts the number of duties accepted in terms of those approaches. And again, the orange column are last year, the blue is this year. And again, you will see a marked increase in the duty that we are accepting. In April 2023, we accepted 29. This year we've accepted 45. You will see in August of this year we accepted 30. That's jumped up to 50. So we expect to see that trajectory of people applying to us who we are required to accept a duty for and support with housing. The difficulty we have is we don't have enough accommodation, or always the right accommodation in the right place at the right time. And so we often have to balance placing people in temporary accommodation, asking them to stay with family and friends for a period of time, and using our key ways. Key ways is our allocations process, which has a number of partners, working with our other partners such as Grand Union and all the other residents and housing associations that we have, to try and see whether we can map and provide people with supported accommodation. So one of the stories you would have seen recently was a press of a young girl who had difficulty being discharged from hospital because we've been unable to find particularly the special accommodation that young child needed to be able to move, particularly adapted property in a particular area to provide the support and care for her. Pleased to say that young lady and her mum have now been housed, and that's been a lot of work of us working with occupational health, adult social care, and the family and support and other organisations to look and find the right accommodation to help and support. This is a snapshot of households that we have in temporary accommodation. So most of the accommodation that we have is purchased and owned by NNC. We own that property, and we look to prioritise placing residents within those accommodations first. Where we can't, where there may be a particular property that's adapted or there's a particular urgency, then we will have to look to see whether other providers can assist us, and also whether we can pay for what we call nightly paid accommodation and bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast and nightly accommodation is incredibly expensive. We spend around £150,000 per month in terms of funding bed and breakfast and nightly paid accommodation. So you can see that's a considerable amount of money. And so the priority for us will be to look in terms of our development portfolio to buy additional properties, whether that's new build or on the open market, so that we can use those to support placing our families who have a homeless and housing need at that time within that accommodation, rather than placing them in hotels, which is not ideal. Most families would want to be in a family home or situation. What we do is we also apply for additional government funding. So we apply for funding which is called LAF, which is Local Authority Housing Fund. There have been 2 rounds. We have been successful in bidding for both of those 2 rounds. The first round we bid for and we secured funding for 30 properties. We do have to match fund that funding. So when the government give us a certain amount, I think we got £3 million, we have to match fund to that additional cost as well. So we've been able to purchase 30 properties within LAF 1, and in LAF 2 we've bid for another 12 properties. That LAF funding is specifically required in this cohort to support Afghan and Ukrainian families fleeing war or other threats to settle into other communities. And by utilising those properties, we are taking the pressure off of the demand on there. Those properties eventually will be brought into the portfolio of housing. So that means that those 40 odd properties, once we've paid off the match funding, will come back into the general housing stock populace and will be fully available to our residents who are in our current properties. We also have some additional funding where we are looking at buying on the open market so that we can provide more properties for our residents, because my responsibility is not just to homeless families, but it's to all of those residents who are on our housing list and their needs have changed and need to change suitable accommodation. So just a snapshot of who we have in temporary accommodation at the moment. 68.6% are families with dependent children or have a resident or a member in that household who has perhaps an adaptation or a vulnerability, and 31% of residents who are in temporary accommodation at the moment are single. I thought it would also be interesting to show you some information on right to buy. So you'll be aware that council residents, after having completed a particular term of tenure, are able to apply to purchase their property at a discount. Currently, the legislation says that they can purchase that property at a discount if eligible, and they are required to pay that discount back if they sell the property within the first 5 years, and also that they should offer that property back to us as the landlord to purchase back as the first. So just some data around the applications that we've seen between 2023 and 24. We often tend to get some speculative applications because people try to test the market and see actually how much their property is, and those properties don't always complete. But the blue table shows you the applications that we will receive from residents within the Kettering area. Corby seems to have more applications in terms of applying, and also Corby does seem to have a higher application of residents that do complete. You will see we've had a drop-off in applications, and that very much, I think, is indicative of the mortgage market and the cost of living at this point in time. So rent, I've mentioned the housing revenue account. That is all of the rent and the service charges that we collect from residents and leaseholders who live in our properties. It is a ring-fence protected sum of money, so it can't be used for any other services within the council. It must only be used for providing services within housing. So this is a table that shows you the rent collected as a percentage of our rent roll, and our target is to collect 97% of that income. To date, we have collected, I think it's about 101% of our income. So that means we've collected our income and a percentage of any rent arrears that have accrued. But considering the cost of living and considering COVID, we are seeing quite strong performance in our recovery of rent. Could absolutely be better, but I think the important thing is that we're being able to help residents sustain their tenancies. We are agreeing plans and improvement and payment plans. There are a small cohort of residents who choose not to pay their rent, and we need to focus our time on those. You know, everybody should be paying their rent. We shouldn't have residents who are paying their rent subsidising residents that aren't, but we recognise there will be times when people have difficulties and circumstances change, and we need to be able to support them. So we have a financial inclusion team that also will look at doing budget management and looking at issues there. We also have a team that focuses on residents who have left us but have former tenant arrears, and we make sure that we are collecting that, because again, every penny of that is public money and needs to come back into the service so that we can maintain our repairs and we can do all the improvements that residents would like to see. So currently our rent arrears, we have a target of 2.5 rent arrears. You can see periodically that dips. There are higher rent arrears as a percentage within the Corby area. At the moment, our arrears are around just under 3% of arrears collected against a target of 2.5. But we also see that there's a trajectory on that. So you will see periods of time where the arrears go up. You will see them go up often in the summer holidays. You will see them often go up at Christmas and in the new year. One of the things we also get is residents who are on universal credit. We get payments 6 weeks in arrears. So sometimes our arrears will go up, and then you will see in February, March, the arrears come down because we've received a lump sum payment in terms of all the universal credit payments that are due. But I think as well, considering the climate, that there is our rent arrears are not high. We are working very much to reduce them. They're not on a level that I would say concerns at the minute, but certainly we need to look at how we can improve that and also reinforce to residents that actually, you know, paying your rent is a requirement of your tenancy agreement, and that if you come and talk to us as quickly as possible, we can work with you to maintain your occupancy in the property. Pleased to say we haven't had many arrears in terms of evictions for rent arrears. Just a snapshot of where our arrears lie, a breakdown between Corby and Kettering. As this progresses, that breakdown will not become Corby and Kettering. We will work to one NC portfolio of information. But that's just a snapshot, and varying reasons why different areas have different issues in terms of arrears. So I've just mentioned that a lot of our residents are on universal credit, and this is a breakdown of a snapshot of residents who were claiming universal credit in 2021 and 2022. You will see in 2021 that there was just over 1,000 in Kettering and just around 1,300 in Corby. That has increased for both areas. So in September 2023, we are seeing for Kettering 1,237, and we are seeing for Corby 1,700. So we have seen a movement within just under 6 months of a movement of from 32.4% of residents receiving universal credit payments to 37%. Often when residents claim their universal credit, there is a backlog of 6 to 8 weeks before they often receive a payment, and that often means that we will not see a payment on their rent account until that time. As long as we are working with the resident and we understand that they have made that application and they've provided the relevant service and the benefits agency all of the information that needs to provide that, then we wouldn't necessarily chase a resident for that, because that's an administrative delay rather than a delay from the resident in terms of providing that. And we also work with residents to make sure that they are claiming the reclaim of benefits. So the financial inclusion team will have calendars and indications of when people's claims are running out, and we will work to support residents in terms of making those claims and making sure there's, again, not too big a gap between them and not having that payment. In terms of when we're making arrangements with people, we also recognise that we need to make reasonable offers and reasonable agreements with them. It would not be appropriate when we look at certain people's budgets to ask them to pay an additional £50 a month. We need to be realistic that actually, you know, whilst we want you to pay your rent, we also want to make sure you can feed your family, you can get to work and you can light and have electricity. So we will do a budget with residents to understand what would be the appropriate agreement for them to pay, and we would work to make sure that they can work with us to try and clear those arrears over 12 months. We also check where people's circumstances change. So you may have a situation where perhaps 2 years ago there was a young person in that household who was 16, but we're now aware that that young person is 18 and they are working. We will talk to that family about whether that young individual is now in employment and whether they could contribute in terms of paying towards the rent and making an agreement. We also understand that some people have had pay rises, but we also understand some people have perhaps shunted to part-time work. And I think I mentioned earlier that, you know, we had one lady who said to us, you know, there's actually no point me working because when I do work, I get £1,200 in terms of a salary, but my child costs in terms of covering that are £1,100. So one of the things we do in terms of wider is looking at that wider, can we look at getting affordable childcare housing? Can we support you with getting better costs and utility bills? What are some of the things that we can do to help you maximise your budget and make those pennies go further? Just in terms of nuisance and antisocial behaviour, excuse my acronym, ASB is antisocial behaviour, but this is just a breakdown of a number of the enforcement actions that we've taken across the borough. So we have a community protection warning, that's when we would formally warn a resident about that behaviour. It tends to be low levels, so that might be dog barking, litter, inconsiderate parking, loud music, and they would be issued with a warning. We also have community protection notices, and that may be you've been provided with a warning, but there's been an escalation in that. Though community protection notice is actually a fine, so you would be fined, and it's a civil penalty. The enforcement that I would be able to utilise from my service would be serving a notice of seeking possession. Just would like to clarify that a notice of seeking possession is not an eviction order. It is a notice that says over the next 12 months, we would want to work with you to avoid, reduce and abate the nuisance. We would want you to sustain your tenancy. But if after that 12-month period that it's not working out, there are more escalations, that it's more serious, then we reserve the right to use that notice to make an application to apply to the court for an eviction. So recently we have had 2 properties where we have had fires in our properties. Investigations identified to us that they were arson, and we have served notices on those 2 residents because we are cognizant that it costs us a lot to repair that property, causes complete distress and terror and fear to residents and safety around them, and it puts residents and others at risk. So we will serve in some of those serious cases, and one case where we've had very serious antisocial behaviour, gang crime, utilising dogs. We've also had one situation where one of our members of staff was attacked by a dog, and we have taken the decision to serve that resident with a notice. In terms of possession proceedings, we've evicted one in NNC at the moment, and that was for a high-level case of antisocial behaviour. So what are my priorities? I've been here 6 months. I've had the opportunity to meet a number of the councillors. I've gone out and met residents. I've gone out with operatives and done some of the works. I'm hoping that one of the emergency repairs wasn't one that I had attempted to do. And I've been out with operatives and I've been talking to stakeholders and partners, as well as looking at some of the wider context around what's happening within NC. And also as part of the senior leadership team here at NC, I have a collective responsibility and duty to ensure that collectively we're working across all of the teams to make sure that NC delivers continually and in the future for our residents. So one of the first things that will be happening will be the STAR survey. That's a survey that goes out to all council residents and leaseholders. The questions are quite prescribed from our regulator as to what they ask and how they do. We can slip a couple of questions in there, but that will be the first snapshot of how residents are feeling about their housing service since vesting day in April 2021. So I'm quite interested in that. It will give me a baseline as to where the service is and what residents think. We need to be mindful, though, that some of that, it does slip in that they think about what's the wider issues that concern them. So some of the answers we get tend to be responses about NNC in its widest sense, not necessarily about just the NNC housing portfolio. But none to say, we hope that will go out in March of this year, and that was a commitment that I had given, I think, when I joined things. So hopefully we'll see that progressing. In terms of tenant engagement, our regulators putting a number of tenant services and service standards, and that requires us to report on a number of key performance indicators around that. But also, I would like to see us engaging more with residents and thinking about how we do that engagement. So to me, engagement is not simply because you come to a meeting. Engagement for me is every time we talk to you on the phone, every time we visit, every time we're walking around your estate, whether you could put a complaint in, all of those ideas and initiatives that you bring to the table so that you have a say in how you are delivering your service. And what I would like to look at is how we deliver the tenant and resident engagement as a service within NNC, and also utilising the valuable experience and knowledge that you as council members have, working with your constituents, telling us about what your residents hear, see and feel, and what are some of the priorities that have there. So tenant engagement, absolutely key. One of the other things I'll be looking at is restructuring the housing service. So as you'll be aware, when we became NNC, a number of the legacy councils moved into all of the housing teams. So I have a number of housing teams that were from the historical councils. I need to look at that structure to see whether that remains for us a fit-for-purpose service, because I want to make sure that we are a service that's agile. And I spoke earlier about us becoming that more professional organisation with regulators. That's not to say my staff are not professional now. That means that we will have a professional qualification which we will work to. But I need to look at those structures to make sure that they are the right and correct structures to build not only a strong platform for housing, but to make sure we are ready to take on the sector and the challenges and deliver an excellent service now and into the future and become that agile and robust service. Very much key will be strategy and policy. So there are a number of policies that we still have to align. We still have some areas where we're working to a core B policy, for example, and we still have some areas that we may be working to an historical catering policy. We need to merge those policies to work to an NNC policy. And the trick is to take the best out of both of those and bring them together into one collective. We also do things differently. So some areas we charge for things, some areas we don't, some areas there's different timelines on delivery, and we need to amalgamate so that if you as a resident within an NNC property and our service are absolutely clear that you will receive the same excellent standard of service across the piece. Key strategy, the housing strategy. Something I know that has been outstanding for some time, so work has started on that. We will be bringing you our case for change in March of 2024, and that will list a lot of the data that sits behind some of the information as to what we believe should be in our strategy going forward for NNC. just to be mindful that that housing strategy is not just about housing, it is about the wider strategy for the entire borough. So it will mean we need to talk to a lot of our stakeholders, including yourself and our residents. I also, having only been here 6 months, whilst learned quite a lot, know a lot about housing, there's a lot of information I still want to make sure that I'm getting and talking to the right people and getting the right data, so that when we roll out that strategy and we put that strategy into place, it's one we have confidence in, it's one that we can deliver and really has the information and intelligence behind it to make that strategy successful. Homelessness strategy, looking at how we look at homelessness strategy, one of the things I'd like to do is relook at a model of temporary accommodation. We certainly need to make sure that we're buying more properties that are adapted, but also not just for temporary accommodation, but to build our stock within our general population of our residents, to give residents more choice and the ability to move as their lifestyle and their choices change. And that also we can have our communities stay together. We're often hearing, aren't we, that our younger residents are priced out of the area and have to move out. But we also have people coming in. I'm a newbie, 13 years still to Corby, but I came in and chose to live within Corby. And we need to make sure that NNC continues to be, as a wider borough, places where people want to live, grow their business, their families, and their communities and our economy, because we have an amazing borough. And you know, I'm very proud to work and work for NNC. And I've mentioned the alignment of policies. But also very key, working on development. I've mentioned that we need to build more properties, the right properties. We need to look at affordability. Very bulleted question, isn't it? Charged question, the word of affordability. What does that mean? And what would that look like? And we need to think about all of the options that we have for people. Is it that you have a council property? Do you purchase your property through the right to buy? Do you let within the private sector? What about shared ownership? You know, we haven't sort of challenged that question. And very much how we're utilising the private sector as well to develop and making sure that we're using the 106 agreements, the power that we have within our influence and planning to make sure that developers are providing affordable properties and good quality affordable properties and properties that are adaptable as residents' lifestyles change. So, question is that I've given you quite a lot of information, but how do I get there and how do we get there on that journey? And for me, this is my motto. It's by working together to achieve success. I won't do this alone. You won't do this alone. Our partners won't do this alone. Our residents won't do this alone. So it's really about using all that information and all of that intelligence and all of that passion, that drive and that information to understand and listen to what our residents need and also what's needed within the wider borough, and making sure we're joining up. You know, when we are talking about housing, am I making sure that when we do that development, we've not isolated you in the farthest corner of the borough, but actually there's no shops, there's no utilities, you know, there's no school, there's no education, you know, what are our transport links? All of those things that will build communities and remain prosperous for our residents to come and live. So that's the end of my presentation. I appreciate there's quite a lot of information. I've given you a worldwide, very quick tour in terms of the housing service. But I'd like to thank you for your time and offer any questions that you may want to put to me. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Yvonne. Very comprehensive. Anyone got any questions? Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many thanks for your very comprehensive and interesting presentation. As you say, there is a lot there to get your head round. I think one of the challenges, one of your main challenges, must be the balancing act between right to buy and the building of new properties. Personally, I've never actually agreed with right to buy. I think they should, like the old council houses, and Wellingborough at one time had about 4,500. They were seen as a stepping stone for people as they sort of move through housing ownership. But once they're sold, you have to rely on an ever-increasing amount of new properties being built. Otherwise, I feel you're more and more dependent on bed and breakfast and private landlords. And this obviously is a challenge which is, it doesn't augur well for the future unless there is going to be a sustainable amount of quality, affordable housing built. Thank you.
Thank you. And as you'll be aware, in terms of the right to buy receipts, we can only use 40% of the right to buy receipts to develop further properties. So really what's important is that stakeholder engagement of looking at, you know, who else is delivering. So for example, One of our partners is building 20 properties within the borough. Now, they've done all the legals, they've done all the groundwork, you know, they've got the design right, that, you know, they've done all the spend. I don't need to spend that again. So I'm in conversation with them and saying, well, you know, instead of building 20, would you build 25, for example? And I fund the other 5, and that we use the Keyways agreement to say, well, of those 5, obviously they would be NNC properties and our residents would have those priorities. We also need to make sure that when our developers are building, that we hold them to their Section 106 agreements. They're required to build a percentage of affordable housing. We need to ensure that they don't come back to us in a year time and go, well, the economy's changed and actually we only want to build 10%. And again, looking at all the grant funding that we can. So in the King's Speech and Homes for England have given a number of other opportunities for grant funding, but also to utilise the private sector more. So we have a number of properties within the borough that are empty. And I'm working with the private sector housing team to understand why they are empty. Is there a model perhaps that we could rent that property from that landlord for a period of 4 to 5 years, guarantee them a rent, but we could utilise that property. The bonus of that is not only does it bring houses that are unoccupied back to occupancy, it gives wider choice to our residents on the housing waiting list or in our general needs stock. It reduces level of crime because you don't have a property there that people are going in and breaking into. And also just the general aesthetics of the community where you don't see a property that's boarded up and doesn't look very nice for residents. So lots of things to put into the mix. And whether also we think about lots of organisations have their own lettings companies. So they have a private lettings company and they let their own properties. So something I'm very passionate about. You'll understand from me, I'm a housing anorak. I live and breathe and I love this thing called housing. But most importantly, I love this thing called people. And part of my job is to try and put those connections and bring partners together to say, how can we do this? How can 1 and 1 make 3 that actually we can get the best? So it will be challenging. But with those challenges, I think also come opportunities and an ability for us to think in a different way about how we deliver our housing for residents now and in the future.
Graham.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a number of questions, and one thing that perhaps is a sort of discussion piece for later, but you've just touched on my first question, actually, empty properties. When the Borough of Wellingborough, as was, had a capital sum set aside for properties it might wish to CPO because of whatever reason they were lying empty or they were derelict. And that was used quite successfully on a few occasions. And of course, as you just said, there's a scheme to rent or lease from people. And so I wondered where we are. That was my first question. I wondered where we are. And when we see these houses on our routes around and various things we do, how do we report them? Who do we report them to? Because if they're not on hopefully they're on the system already, but if they're not, we need to get them there. The second question was, obviously, in all the paper, we've got 2, I know it's one account, but 2 separate schemes. So where are we with getting them harmonised, including the thorny question of the different levels of rent, I know. But where are we with getting that done? The third thing, you had a slide, I think it was on the number of, on the backlog of repairs, but what it didn't say was the time taken. It said the numbers, but it didn't say the time, or any average time taken to do those repairs. And the last one, in slide 10, you've got the applications, but are you expecting a bit of a spike with the various Afghan and Ukraine schemes that are coming to an end? Is that a spike that you're expecting, and are we prepared for it?
So first question, in terms of the empty homes, I've been working with Amy Plank in the regulator team who's responsible for private sector housing. We had a meeting this week, and I think we've actually got one tomorrow, where we are now starting the discussions around, could we compulsory purchase some of these empty properties? Could I use some capital funding to actually purchase those properties? Also about grant funding, how we would give landlords grant to bring some of their properties up to standard, and whether we would put a charge on the property so that obviously we would be able to recoup that money back. and also making sure that the properties are hitting fire regulation. Amy's team are doing a fantastic piece of work, so I'm aware of the number of properties that we have empty, and she has a team going out and actually identifying and looking at the circumstances as to why they are empty. You know, is it death? Is it in probate? Can they just not afford the repairs and the maintenance? Some are mental capacity issues, so we have a resident that's in hospital and can't manage that. Some of them are family disputes where they may not have got the percentage of the inheritance that they wanted, and there is a family dispute between those. So lots of reasons as to why we have properties that there, but the team are working incredibly hard to do that. And as I said, it's about us putting those components together and saying, well, how can we do that? How can we bring more properties online to help communities, but also to bring other people into the communities that will come and work within there. So lots of work being done, and I'm fully committed to do that. We're having those conversations already. In terms of reporting those, they would be into Amy Plank's team, which would be the empty homes team. And also I understand that an empty home strategy is being worked on, so we will have a wider conversation around that. And I've made a commitment that that empty home strategy links into my housing strategy, and my housing strategy links across into the homeless strategy. In terms of Afghan and Ukraine, yes, we will see an increase, and we are likely to see an increase due to the Gaza and the Israeli issue that we're seeing on the telly. So we don't know whether we'll get additional funding. But as I said, the LAF funding, once we have a cohort of Afghan families and Ukraine families in, not all of them are coming to us to utilise our accommodation. Again, it's about navigating some of those to the private sector. But those 40 properties we bring online will eventually come into the populace for our residents to be able to use as well. And we've made a decision that we will put those tenancies on a licence agreement so that actually once that family no longer leaves that, we can bring that in once we've paid off the appropriate loans back into housing stock. In terms of the backlog of repairs, I don't know the time it's taken to do those individual backlog repairs. What we did is we checked the numbers and we said that we would commit to fully completing the outstanding. The issue with the backlog repairs is that actually when we go and we're told it could be a leak, that could be anything from a tap leaking to a floor having collapsed and a ceiling having come through. So in terms of the timescale, it's difficult for me to give you that time frame, other than to say that our commitment was we will get through all of those backlog repairs, and we seem to be on target for those. And there was one question I think I may have missed from you. So the HRA accounts, so we have the two neighbourhood accounts at the minute. What we need to do is we need to do some more configurations of just realigning those. And one of the main things is I have to align policies and procedures and ICT to sit behind that first before we can align some of those accounts. So it's a piece of work I've started with my cohort AD in finance. So we are looking at those. And one of the things we have been spending this year is just for me to make sure that we do have the correct budgets aligned with the right Corby and the catering accounts, making sure we've cleansed those first. We then need to align the policies and the procedures, and then make sure we've got ICT that sits behind that. So we are working towards that, and that is one of the priorities. So we will get there.
To add a bit more on the empty homes, there's something like 1,200 houses already identified by the team, and they're working through to produce a strategy. If a councillor thinks they found one, then put it through the members' inquiry system is probably the best way of doing it. And then it'll be recorded and captured then. Yeah, I've got Andy, and then I'll come to you, Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding the time to do housing repairs, it's not the average that you need to look at, it's the spread, because the average, the median is more interesting. In other words, that how long most houses take to be repaired, because you find there's a few that take in excessive time, well over a year, and that distorts and biases the average. Right, I've got quite a few various issues to raise, so I'll do a couple, then come back again. All right, well, first of all, methods of rent recovery. You mentioned evictions. One would hope that would be the last resort. Yeah. But I'd be interested to, first of all, hear what strategy you have for doing it. The reason I ask this is that when I was about 10 years ago at East Northants, I discovered that they had a policy that they prosecuted and jailed people for arrears of council tax as the first instant. They didn't try going to a debt collector or a bailiff or anything like that. They just went straight for jailing. And at one point, I found they had 8 people in jail, costing the country an arm and a leg for nothing, basically. So I managed to get that fixed, but I would like to have assurance that we've got a sequence of escalation so we don't go for the big guns right at the beginning. That's the first thing. The second is cuckooing, which no one's mentioned. There is an increasing problem that vulnerable people are exploited, and quite often it's very difficult to detect that it's happening. I'm aware of at least one case that one of the councillors adjacent to me is dealing with, where it doesn't seem that any of the statutory authorities seem to be able to do anything about it. We can see it's happening, but we can't seem to find a way of dealing with it. So I'd be interested to hear what your strategy is, your policies, if you have any written yet, on that. Next, you mentioned antisocial behaviour. I've got it switched on, yeah. I don't think antisocial behaviour is a crisis of any sort at all in the houses that are within the HRA. Our problem seems to be houses that are in housing associations that are far less responsive to our issues. So I've come across a number of problems where there have been antisocial behaviour issues so severe that neighbours have moved out, but the housing association would not tackle it with the actual perpetrator. So I'm wondering whether or not we've got any mechanism to lean on the housing associations to do what should be their duty, but which particularly the large national ones tend to run away from. So that's the first batch, thanks.
Excuse me. So we do have a rent arrears procedure. It is one I'm looking to review because we have 2 different processes. So that's some of the realignment that we have to do. But what we do is, to me, rent arrears recovery starts before someone gets into arrears, which might sound a bit counterintuitive, but it's about making sure we've done the right assessment so that we understand their affordability and they can afford to pay the rent. We have 2 to 3 letters before they're in arrears. So letter 1, it might just be, have you put your standing order in? Have you applied for your universal credit? I mentioned earlier we will help people make those applications. There is a distinct difference that we would work to residents who choose not to pay the rent, and there are a cohort that do, and those that are struggling. And we have lots of different payment methods to enable people to pay the rent. What we would do is we eventually would get to a level where we would serve a notice of seeking possession if all of those interventions and those agreements haven't worked. And that notice is not to evict, it is to protect our interests, so it protects us the money, but it also says to a resident, you now have 12 months to work with us, however that may be, to help you manage your tenancy. And we have some residents who've never had to manage budgets. I've got a lady whose husband's died and he always looked after the finances. She never had to worry about it. And she's gone into arrears because, at the age of 72, she's never had to deal with that. And those are certainly cases where we would not be looking to serve someone with a notice. We also want to look at supporting people to reduce utilities and other spends. But where there is a consistent pattern of refusing to engage with us, or the debt becomes high, then we would have to go through it's a court protocol. And so the court would require us to have undertaken an evidence that we've done these escalations and steps, that we've written, that we've visited, that we've tried other ways. Often we can actually make an application to get benefit paid direct. Most councils' arrears went up when universal credit payments changed and the Welfare Reform Act came in, where residents got their rent themselves and then had to start paying us. And most residents spent that money before they paid us. So we have to show to the court that we would want to secure that. Importantly, when we go to court, we still have that opportunity to get an agreement with the tenant. So that agreement would be agreement based on the current rent plus an amount to pay off the arrears, and we would combine that in a court order. And that would say that actually, as long as you pay your rent, you would not be evicted. So eviction is the very last of this, because it's not a win. It means we've got somebody out of a property, we're not getting rent for it, we pick up all the extra voids and maintenance, they come back through to us in terms of temporary accommodation, we pay a larger temporary accommodation bill. So we would want to sustain, but there are cases for high rent arrears. We also have a lottery winner in the borough, and that lottery winner in the borough was paying current rent plus £4 a week. My view was, I think that is one family at the very least who should be able to clear their rent arrears. So when we become aware of situations that are different, we will be talking to people in that. But we do have to say to people, you know, you can't live free anywhere. We do still have a differential of rent, which I think our colleague over there mentioned, where we have different rents in Corby and Kettering. But any new tenancy signed up under NNC is put on the new rent. So we are looking over time, we will resolve that differential. And if a resident moves from a current council property into a brand new property, then we would have to have discussion about that rent changing. So I think over a period of time that will evolve and resolve itself. But essentially rent collection is key because it does pay for all of our services, and it's not right that people who are in arrears, for whatever reason, who are not paying their arrears, are subsidised by those people that are paying their rent. And so we always have to have that balance on there. So yes, we do have the escalations in place. You've mentioned cuckooing, and just for clarification, that's where we may have a vulnerable resident where another person, either known or unknown to them, will come into the property and can take over that property. We're often finding that with vulnerable residents, and we often find that is around antisocial behaviour, drugs, and gang associated. We've had 2 cases that I'm aware of here. On both of those cases, we have been able to remove that person from the property and take possession of that property and exit the individuals that were cocooning. Often we talk to adult social care because often some of that is a person known and it's a safeguarding issue. So it may be a younger relative or a child or someone that's coming in, and you're often finding some of our elderly residents where, because of the cost of living, adult children are moving back, and some issues are resulting because of that. So it's something we are very, very much aware of. There aren't many cases, but when the cases that do happen, they are quite shocking. And cuckooing can be anything from just taking their money. So often we will find someone who's not had arrears before suddenly starts to have arrears, and when you're talking to them, you're finding out that their money is being taken or it's being used for other things. So the team, when they're going out in terms of their housing management, are looking at that vulnerabilities. And I know Councillor Buckingham raised in a previous meeting that when we have repairs operatives going into properties, and you know, if they are identifying safeguardings, they are often reporting to us if they have any issues of concern. So we do deal with those. In terms of ASB, we have low-level ASB. I think you're quite right here. Some of the ASB we have is from private owners and it is from housing associations. And we don't have much influence, if I'm honest, in terms of managing that because we don't hold the tenancy. So often we will talk to another landlord and we'll say, well, look, your tenant is causing us a problem, and this is the level of the impact they have. They have a licence and a tenancy agreement. They have legislation and law and powers similar to ours, and we'd be asking them as to whether they would consider affecting those. So that would be some of the influence we would have. In absolute severe cases, where, for example, not here, but in a previous place I worked, a housing association literally firebombed our property, because the landlord didn't take appropriate action, we took out an injunction against that. But it would be very few and far between in extreme cases. And really the powers are with the community wardens and also with the police in terms of engaging that. And I would advocate for any of those residents who are having that impact to go and speak to their council member and to the housing association, and if necessary the ombudsman, to try and push that housing association to take their responsibility for what they are doing. Okay, and then the fourth one, sorry, I'd missed your...
I've only given you a couple at the moment, but because I wanted to come back perhaps on one of them, that's one where I would like to come back. I know of at least one case within this area where the antisocial behaviour has been so severe that people are being forced to move out. The police have been involved. They've visited various times, but they've not been prepared to take any action. And the Housing Association itself is essentially not interested. It's one where if we were the regulator, I'm absolutely certain we would take enforcement against the Housing Association. It looks to me as though we're still in the same situation, that we've got to rely upon the external regulator to do the job, and if they don't do it, we're basically stuffed.
No, I mean, I think the regulator does play a place, and we also need to understand that often this has to be done by evidence. So often what you will find is residents don't want to give us that evidence because obviously they've got to live there and it's not safe for them. So it would be really the challenge for the housing organisation, what have you, to look at other ways they could perhaps gather some of that evidence. They could use, private investigators or other things to do that. But in that particular case, I would advocate certainly talking to the police and seeing what other information that they can get on there. But I couldn't comment further with it not being ours and not knowing that case.
Obviously, I can't mention a specific case, obviously.
If I can just add to that, because I think I can probably answer it for you, Councillor Mercer. The duty would actually, the correct process would be that, as you rightly say, that first of all, the resident must raise their concerns with the housing provider, so that, i.e. the housing association. If they then fail to take any action, and unfortunately you are right that it does happen, I've dealt with cases personally as well, but the recourse that we then have is the private sector housing team, which doesn't fall under Yvonne, it falls under regulatory services, as you know. And there is a process, and that process is documented on our website. They will be treated in the same fashion as a private sector landlord by the private sector housing team, and they will then follow that case through. And I know this because I've personally had cases where I've had to do that and pass that through to the private sector housing team. And of course, failing that, if the resident still remains unhappy and they're not happy with the service provided by the private sector housing team, they then have the option of taking it to the Ombudsman service as well.
Okay. I'm afraid I'm aware of at least one case where that whole process has gone through and it's ended up with no outcome at the end, but at least it is a path. Okay. Lynn.
Good morning. 6 months? Wow, what a lot you've done in that time. And I know that we've had our little discussions, but from what I can see, you've come in, absolutely looked at every single part of this housing service. So thank you for that. Still got lots of questions to ask though. And like Councillor Mercer, I will split a little bit. So some of these I've raised in the past. The repairs service. So I know I raised last year that we seem to be having a lot more emergency repairs rather than responses. Has that emergency responses split come down? I know that we've got to look at stock condition surveys and where we can make those improvements in the future. And are any of those emergency repairs that we had data on, did those include the gas servicing and not servicing, but the gas boiler breakdowns and things like that? In terms of temporary accommodation, I understand, and I've been supporting a number of people in temporary accommodation, and from what I've seen at the moment, there seems to be a lack of support for some people who have gone from chaotic lifestyles into temporary accommodation, but they've been then settled with eviction arrears. They've been, they have storage solutions that they've got to find. They're struggling for transport to get their kids to school because they're not in the right area. And some of those things around the temporary accommodation, I would like to see more support given or solutions found. LAF, I wish it wasn't that acronym, you know, for that. The police flats, there's 16 flats at the other side of this town centre, which have been empty for the last 4 years. I wish we could have got a sort of leasing going on that would sort of give us that as temporary accommodation. And I hope that it's not going to be knocked down. Just one more small one. Strategic partnerships and the social housing charter is looking at a range of solutions to housing problems, the rent to buy, the new product which will be shared ownership, but those low cost go in but sort of stay. And the strategic partnership with our neighbours is, as you say, so pivotal in terms of using their skills and whatever. So 100% support you on that. Thank you very much. That's all mine.
Thank you, Councillor Buckingham. So just come back to you on that, if that's okay, Chair. In terms of the emergency repairs, they can be a range of things. Can be no water, boilers broken down, you know, lots of things. There may be one or two that, you know, a boiler has broken down, and if it's broken down, then, you know, we have a period of time to make sure we fixed it and do that. What's really important then is around that issue when I spoke to you about compliance and making sure that we have all of our gas certifications done. We've achieved 96% out of 100 of all gas certifications. We've procured a new gas and electric comply to make sure we're on top of those. I don't have any data on whether an emergency has become an emergency because we failed to do a original repair previously. I'd have to look at some of that data to come back. But you will always have a period of emergency repairs, and looking at the chart that I gave you, that there seems to have been that kind of level of emergency repairs 2 to 3 years ago. So we haven't seen a massive escalation. And I think from that table we showed you as well, all the repairs were done. A few just out of target, but all of those were done. So yeah, looking at the day-to-day repairs, responsive and emergency, something I've got a definite eye on, as you'll be aware. In terms of temporary accommodation, yeah, I do agree with you. We often have residents who are in crisis at that time of temporary accommodation. And when I'm looking at the temporary accommodation model, it isn't just about the type of property we provide, but it is about that whole support network around it. But preventative work, we really need to stack up the preventative work to try and stop our families and young people becoming homeless in the first place, but also some of their support skills. So when I mention about the housing restructure, one of the things I'd like to look at is an attentive housing support model that is helping not only our residents within our general needs stock, but also our temporary accommodation stock, and using all of the avenues. Again, anybody who, you know, we talk about when our repairs operatives going in and looking at all of that safeguarding to make sure we've got the information, but importantly, the staff with the skills to be able to do that and to make the appropriate referrals and making sure we're using the partnerships with adult social care, children's services. I sit on the children parenting board to make sure we've got all those cross links. In terms of LAF, yeah, it probably could have been a better acronym, but that's predominantly for the Afghan cohort. The other spend that we spend in terms of the police, properties, and that's more the development side. So that's looking at. So I'm quite sad, and I drive around and I see empty properties. And I recently saw a development. There was a garage space, and now there's houses on it. And I knocked the door and I went, "Who built your house?" So we can get all of that local information, but the partnering information to look at how we develop. And I know that there is a building by Kettering train station that's been empty for a while, and we're talking with partners about how we can bring that property back into stock, because a lot of it will be working with other agencies, accommodation concern and other areas to support them in terms of bringing things back. But the strategic partnerships, reaching out already, but a lot more work that I would need to be able to do. And I think once I've got the structure right underneath me, that will give me that opportunity to go out and do some more of that strategic stuff, as well as getting into the operational stuff. And yes, we need to give people choice. Not just a council house or just buying, but rent to buy, shared ownership. And again, that's very much our planning and a development, and also the law that's changing to enable some of that to support us. But yes, it's been a very busy, enjoyable, but full-on 6 months, Councillor Buckingham. Thank you.
Malcolm.
Thank you, Chairman. Yvonne, I'm going to look at your tenancy engagement policy, because obviously I think the main plank of that will actually be your survey, but do you have any other tools in the box that you are going to use or have thought about using?
So we need to look at our tenant engagement policy, and I think we need to look at our model, because I think it is very much driven by somebody coming to a meeting. And we've got things like SurveyMonkey, and a lot of people engage with us when there is a problem, if there's something they want to tell us. But we shouldn't make the assumption that because they haven't spoken that they're okay, and vice versa. So I would like to look at a menu of engagement that looks at many different ways that you can come. You can come to a meeting, you could do a survey, you can come on a state walkabout with us, you could help us with an event. Every time you put a complaint in, we need to analyse those complaints. What are they telling us? I've got one dedicated tenant engagement officer at the moment. I don't believe that is enough. But also, tenancy engagement is not the responsibility of the tenant engagement officer. It is the responsibility of every single member of staff in my service. It may be driven by a local team. So I want to expand that team. And I think that a lot of that will be based on what I'm hearing from you as councillors, what I'm hearing from you as members, but very much I think from the surveys will help me start to frame some of that within the structure. On there. So, and also, as Councillor Buckingham will know, lots of regulation from the Regulator of Social Housing, Chartered Institute Housing of best practice about how we engage, and also how we engage our young community, our young adults children that are living on our estates who may become residents in the future. All those people who we have the usual suspects to come and talk to us, but what about the people that don't? And a lot of this is we often rely on people coming to us, and I think we should be going out into our community more. So we've got a lot of community halls, a lot of community centres. I would want us to see us being there and using the hub network that we have within the borough to really engage with all of our residents, not just council tenants. So yes, I would like to, as part of one of my strategies, review our engagement strategy and have a clear resident engagement strategy with purpose, design, outputs and involvement.
Thank you for that. Yeah, walkabouts, I always thought they must be a good idea until I've been on a few over the years, and I can see your problem in actually engaging in that way, because they don't get a great turnout, and in the ones I've got, unfortunately, they've been from social landlords, not council. They always say, "Oh, we'll follow up all those problems, etc." And I, as a ward councillor, would get a report, etc. Never happened in 16 years, I'm afraid. So, if you're going down that route, it needs to be tightly controlled. Thank you.
Cheers for that, Graham.
This is my last lot, I promise, unless it's supplementaries. Right. First of all, we are Northants Council. And we had 2 out of our 4 former districts or boroughs had housing revenue accounts. 2 of them didn't. We will have, by law, to have very shortly a single housing revenue account, which will cover the whole district. At the moment, we have no houses that are owned by this council, to my knowledge, outside the former boroughs of Corby and Kettering. What plans have we got to look at providing housing in our HRA outside those two limited areas, because they're less than half the total geographical area? That's the first question. The second is a more technical one. When we try to apply a requirement to developers that they provide a percentage of affordable housing within a development, we constantly have pushback from the developers, and in particular they use the concept of viability to claim that they can't do that development with that level of affordable housing, or else it will be unviable and be forced to walk away. Unfortunately, the planning inspectorate and the courts have very often sided with the developers, and as a result we've had some developments with zero affordable housing, despite the best efforts of the councillors on the planning committees. Now, so my question is this: have we considered doing any almost blue sky work to develop ideas about how to assess viability in order to challenge the assessments by the developers? Because in many cases they don't look credible to me. I don't believe their claims about viability, but they have hard and fast evidence. They have reports from professionals, and we're amateurs. Therefore, automatically the inspectorate and the courts dismiss or downgrade our opinions and just take the professionals. The net result is we get a lot less affordable housing built than we should. Whereas if we have some policy work, some statistical work to support our assertions that this is viable, then we would stand a good chance of getting more affordable housing. So the question I'm asking is, can we look into doing something like that? And in particular, can we look at other councils who face this same problem and dealt with it? So that's the first one of them. Right, or the second one, I think. Right, next one is, so I've dealt with locations and viability, and the final one I've got is when we are forced to evict someone for particularly antisocial behaviour, they then become homeless, and we then have a duty to house them. So how do we put them into a position where they're no longer causing us problems? Because the last thing we ever want to have to do is to evict someone from the place we've just put them into. So 3 questions for you. Thank you.
Okay, so your first question, just in terms of where we are building Corby and Kettering, yes, most of our stock is within those areas, but the LAF properties that we've recently bought are within Wellingborough, and in terms of the development model, we recognise all of NNC, so we are looking at the entire borough in terms of where we are purchasing and buying, and that's also in working with our stakeholders and partners who may, so for example, Greatwell Homes, predominantly based in Wellingborough, I may need to have a conversation with them and go, well, you're there, you know the landscape, you're building, could you build 3 more for me? You know, and those are the types of conversations that we need to be having. So it's much wider, and even as far as our colleagues in East Midlands Housing, which is Leicestershire, you know, again, they're building on all of the different areas. So yes, part of the development plan, when we bring that to you, we'll be looking at how we use all of our areas and stock and viability in all the communities that are being built there. In terms of the Section 1 agreement, I think I mentioned that earlier, that we do have powers already that say, actually, no, once you've done a viability and you've come with us with the requirement to develop 20% of affordable housing. I think the issue is that you're quite right, that when they get into the planning meeting, they come with you with it's not going to be viable. My experience is that's not always the case, and we need to push back more and say, no, actually, the purpose of the original approval of giving you this funding was a 20% affordability. We would expect you to deliver that. Most of them won't leave the market because you've enforced that. And I'm aware of that. So one of the things I'm doing is I've already found out when the planning meetings are, and we're looking at having a representative from the developer and the enabling team come to those meetings. But also when planners, they're working with planners to have more liaison internally with the planning to talk to us about those agreements. And also in the Section 1 agreement, if they don't want to pay and provide affordable housing, then there's often a trade-off, a financial payment they need to provide, so that if they don't build those affordable, there is a payment made so that we can look at those affordability issues for you. So certainly on the case. In terms of a resident that's evicted, the legislation requires that we have a duty to investigate. So if you are evicted and you rock up to any council, we have 56 days to investigate your claim and case for homelessness, to see whether you are truly homeless and the circumstances of you having lost your last permanent secure accommodation. If those investigations in those 56 days identify that you lost your home purely because of your antisocial behaviour and or your nuisance, the legislation allows us to make a decision of intentionality. It means that we do not have a duty to find you alternative accommodation or rehouse you because of the circumstances in which you lost your accommodation. It would deem it to be an intentional act on your part. But the legislation does require us to refer and offer guidance and advice. So in those occasions, if you were deemed to be intentionally homeless, then we would offer you advice, whether that's looking at the private sector, other opportunities, or refer you to another agency that can help. During that 56 days, we may be required to provide you with temporary accommodation, again, whilst we're doing those investigations. So, yes, we will have cases where somebody's evicted, they come back to the council, we will be seen to have to house them because that's our duty, but investigations may determine that we don't have a legal duty to house you or provide you with further accommodation because of your intentional act and your behaviour previously. So they don't necessarily come back through the temporary accommodation or homeless and housing route, and they wouldn't necessarily be rehoused. So, for example, the question would be for the two individuals that purposely set fire to our property when we seek an eviction, and on one of those we absolutely will. They are likely to come back to us to say that they are homeless. You can't make any assumptions now, but we have to understand what were the circumstances of that to make a decision. But yes, there is a perception that we evict you, and then in 3 weeks' time we put you back in another property or a different property. And that's in a perception, it's not actually true in the process that we have to undertake.
Thank you. Graham, and then you.
Thank you. Two things. I'll first of all talk about walkabouts because I have the Hemingwell in my patch. And we've done quite a number of walkabouts with Greatwell Homes, obviously. And also, we did several with the Arson Task Force when there were fires and so on. So, and that was quite a good intro. People were quite happy to answer the door to them. But as the EAPs are supposed to be an organisation that provides advice to the executive on strategy, I hope we could have a small discussion on one major thing. A bit of history first. I was chairman of the working group that organised the stock transfer for the borough of Wellingborough to Wellingborough Homes as was, and I subsequently sat on the board of what was. So I had a bit of insight from both sides. And I understand that some of the regulations may have changed, but is this something that, I mean, we have options, obviously, to with the housing. We have a possible option of moving them to a registered provider, either one that's currently there or setting up a new one, or going to an Almo as Northampton did. When we looked at it at the time, there was a lot of emotional feeling about losing housing stock, but when you looked at it, the investment that the RP could put in, both in the properties themselves, raising the standard in the environmental works that they've done, and in the building being able to fund new buildings, both on their own and as part of 106 agreements. It's been a tremendous boon to the quality of the stock and the quality of people's lives in the estates. So is this something that we can look at, we'll be looking at as part of the strategy, and not just dismissing for whatever reason?
Before you answer, fully agree with what you said, but I think that whole discussion is an EAP on its own, because we'll be here all day otherwise doing the ins and outs and that. So yeah, if we add it to as a future EAP agenda item in its own right.
As long as it is discussed and not just...
Yeah, I'm fully up for the discussion. I just feel that if we start it now, we'll be here all day.
Thank you.
Okay. Elliot.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks everyone for your presentation. You mentioned just a moment ago regarding, in answer to Councillor Mercer's question regarding residents who are evicted and they're not necessarily put back into the cycle of being rehomed. Do we have a large number of those type of people in the unitary? And is there a period of time that can pass before we're then able to assist those people again? Obviously, the circumstances that drove them to eviction may have changed, and etc. Thanks.
So just to be clear, we always assist. So the requirement statutory is to provide either the duty to house, to investigate or refer or provide advice. So they're never left out in the cold, as it were, quite literally. We will provide that support and advice and guidance on there. We have very few people who, will, I would say, are being evicted and then coming back. And often some evictions may be 4 or 5, many years ago as circumstances have changed, and the legislation requires us to look at their last permanent accommodation. But to everybody who approaches us for advice or guidance, regardless of the circumstance to which they became homeless, we will provide advice and assistance and offer support. So I just wanted to reassure you that is happening on there. And again, some people may have been evicted for domestic violence, cocoing, other things that were outside of their control, and we need to understand what that. So it is always on a case-by-case basis, but there will be some occasions where there are intentionality decisions made, but everybody will be provided guidance and support.
Lee.
Sorry, just a quick last two. One of the big things that's going to come in, obviously, at the start of the new year, the new dog ban, especially around the bully breeds. And we know that there's quite a lot of bully breeds here within our tenancies. So that's the first one. I know it's going to be a difficult piece of work for you. And the very, very last one, you were talking about the professionalism, and that will have an impact on your budget. Will that come from the HRA budget? Will that come from a general budget? And what implications will that have for you?
So just in terms of the dogs, tenants will need to continue to comply with their tenancy agreement in terms of how they're managing their dogs. So necessarily a breed being banned is not necessarily automatically a breed of one's tenancy agreement. And it depends what that ban is. So it may be that, that it has to be muzzled or kept in an area. So we would have to look at that on a case-by-case basis in terms of the ASB. So just the fact that it may be banned is not necessarily following that's a breach of tenancy. As I said, we did have one incident where we had an operative attacked, and I made the decision that we would serve notice on that resident, not just because it attacked a member of staff, but because residents were also telling us that these dogs had been out of control for a considerable period of time, and those dogs are of that required breed on there. Although I did have a Chihuahua that bit one of my members of staff as well. Not as big a beast, but we still served a warning in relation to that. So we're going to have to just watch and wait and see for that. Just in terms of the professionalism, what we are aware is that there will not be any additional funding to us for that at this moment in time. The government haven't been quite specific as that yet. It hasn't required that every single member of staff has the qualifications, so it's given us a cohort of ones it does believe are applicable. We will be able to use some apprenticeship funding to be able to support some of that training. The issue we have is I think the CIH qualification on its own is about £4,000 if we pay for that outright, each individual, but the apprenticeship levy could mean that it would only cost us £400 to get that member of staff trained, but it may be that training is a longer period of time. So we are just looking at how that will be. Obviously, the things I have to do is that people have to have time off to be trained, and I need to make sure that there is enough people left to do the service provision. And I don't want this professionalism to be a tick box. I don't want us to go, well, we've got 20 people through, we've ticked that box. I want to make sure that experience, that people learn, that they gain the qualification, the benefit of it, and most importantly, our residents see the outcome of that. So I wouldn't necessarily be an advocate of rushing people through the 9 months just to tick a tick box. And I want to make sure that we internally are giving people the skills, so taking them all out on a walkabout and doing other things. And if we have more money to spend, it costs me $325 as opposed to 4,000, and that means I can train more people within my service. So we're looking at all of that as well. Also, whether I have to get requalified, David Watts may have to take the qualification. We're just looking at how that is. So yeah, you know, my master's degree in housing, I'm a corporate member of the Chartered Institute of Housing, a fellow member. I sit on their various committees. May not mean anything to somebody in the Chartered Institute of Housing. I may still myself have to go through this new training course. Absolutely happy to do. In fact, I'd like to, because it now means that I will understand what the course will be for my staff, so that I am better placed to support residents going through that, staff going through that cohort too. So something we're absolutely looking at, and I'm having meetings weekly on how we do that, and talking to other organisations about how they are doing it, because it may be we can procure a provider who will do something, you know, wider for us, and we can do that together. So yeah, you know, my staff who would like that training and development, we absolutely welcome.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from anybody else before I let Matt loose with his long list? So if you could keep the answers succinct, that'd be excellent. Thank you. Off you go.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. First of all, Yvonne, thank you ever so much for coming along today and for that, I suppose, long but succinct presentation, bearing in mind there's an awful lot to try and get in there in a very short space of time. First of all, just to pick up on a few bits that members have made points around the table. Councillor Allabone, I completely agree with you on right to buy. I too share the same opinion as you. It's not something that I like, but unfortunately at the moment it's here to stay unless there's a change in legislation. What I would point out, though, with regards to right to buy is, and this is very general, but there is very much a hang-up about us as a local authority building new houses with right to buy receipts. There are actually 5 potential uses for right to buy receipts. It doesn't just have to be about housing development. There are things whereby actually we can work with social housing providers to build new houses. We can go out and we can buy new houses. We can use the money to carry out sort of rejuvenation works on our housing stock. So that there are actually quite a few uses out there that not everybody is aware of. And I think that, of course, is something that's got to be looked at holistically when we come to producing our social housing strategy, because it is quite an interesting piece of work. Councillor Buckingham, you raised a very interesting point with regards to the high volume of emergency repairs, as this is something that I looked into when I was the portfolio holder. As I understand that there does seem to be an issue within a certain area of an undue number of emergency issues being raised, and when our housing repairs team arrive, unfortunately, it is not as reported. And of course, that's not something that you can filter out over the telephone. And quite rightly, our staff do not then leave the property to leave the repair outstanding, because as we know, one of the biggest challenges that you have when you manage a field team is the travel to and from the location. So it would be an incredibly inefficient practice to actually leave that property and leave that repair outstanding, even though it may not be classed as an emergency one. And you are right, and in fact, this is a question I do have for Yvonne, is I would be interested to know as to whether any progress has been made with regards to any kind of possible way of dealing with incorrect reports, bearing in mind, as you've said, there is a tenancy agreement, as to whether there is any recourse, whether that be, and I am just spitballing here, but fines, etc. And I I would also just raise, as it's been mentioned a couple of times, just for absolute clarity, we operate a single housing revenue account in Northamptonshire. We have 2 neighbourhood accounts, and I know that people may think that that's arguing semantics, but it is very, very important that we operate a single HRA. It's just that we have 2 neighbourhood accounts. And I too share the concerns with regards to the long-term empty homes, and I can confirm that my co-chair was absolutely correct with the 1,200 figure is a figure that I know that the private sector housing team have been looking at under regulatory services. So I'm too keen. I appreciate, Yvonne, you can't answer this because of course it sits under Ian Smith, that be progressed, because it was always discussed about Wellingborough and the huge amount of work that they did over there to bring some of those back into use. And then I would also just like to raise, and unfortunately I am going to break this up, Yvonne, because there is far more for me to talk about, temporary accommodation provision. And I hasten to add that Councillor Mercer, sitting next to me, was the executive member responsible for introducing SNH, also known as Euro Hotel, and bearing in mind how we are reliant still on that service, and it's still hugely successful over in Wellingborough. Whether we are looking as a local authority at any other temporary accommodation provisions within the area, whether they be outsourced or whether we are looking at taking anything in-house. And also on that front, bearing in mind the change in the weather, are we prepared as an authority to handle any influx, bearing in mind we've talked about the increase in rough sleepers for the upcoming SWEP provision. I'll leave it there for now, and then I'll go through the rest in a moment.
So just in terms of incorrect reporting of repairs, you're correct. Once we get there, we try and do the repair, but we will have a number of residents who report repairs for various reasons. And I say that because we have a cohort of residents who call us about a repair, and actually they're actually lonely, and that they need someone to engage and interact with them, or that some people just don't have the skills to understand that you know, it's a minor repair. You could change the plug yourself. You don't necessarily need us to do that. We are seeing an increase of people who, I don't know, have watched every new improvement programme you could possibly see, and have made some wonderful and exciting amendments to their property that we are having to deal with. But if we are consistently called out to repairs that we start to identify our residents' damage, then we are looking at serving recharging. I have one property that I've become aware of where we have spent in excess of £10,000 in terms of repairing that property. There are consistent windows being taken out. There are, you know, bathrooms and toilets being broken. I think we were advised that if we put a white toilet in, you know, that didn't match that person's preferential choice, they would smash it. So we need to take a more robust approach to residents who are abusing our property, because that £10,000 there is £10,000 I'm not spending on putting kitchens and bathrooms in for others. So on that particular case, I am instructing that a notice will be served. Again, it wouldn't necessarily be an eviction. It would be very, very clear. You need to come to an agreement to A, stop abusing our property and causing the nuisance, have a repayment model to be able to pay off what you've paid. Should there be any further incidents, then we would take a case to court to ask a court to consider repossessing your home. So I think it's a different gradients, Councillor Binley, as to how we would manage that. But, you know, we have a number of residents who are damaging and trashing our properties, and we need to understand why. You know, if there's a mental health or there's some other issue there, we need to provide that support. But actually, we do need to recharge, because that all comes out of the ring fence money for HRA, and it's, you know, it's other residents paying for that work that we can't do the other repairs and improvements to. Just in terms of temporary accommodation provision, I'm taking a real deep dive and a complete review about our entire provision of temporary accommodation and the models, how we use it, looking at good practice not only within this area, but you're aware I've worked in London, which has a predominantly much greater, more intense impact of temporary accommodation, and I think we need to look at that whole model, but utilise our private sector and other provisions and providers to do that. So absolutely yes on the list to do that. SWEP, yes, we are as ready as we can ever be for that, depending on what the weather will be, and we utilise the same protocols. We must work to a shift to reduce the hotel accommodation. There are some models that are working. So one thing I did at a previous organisation is we had some sheltered housing schemes that were just not popular. They just weren't being used. We had about a 70% vacancy rate there, and we were able to bring in a provider who would provide temporary accommodation and support to be able to do that. Not saying that that's necessarily what we could do here, but it's an example of other things that we can look at to look at the temporary accommodation provision. But importantly, it's that front-loading work. It's to try and stop people becoming homeless in the first place. So talking to their landlords about how we can support you. No, you can't evict them. You know, you've got to go through the right protocol. You know, are you claiming the right benefit? Can we do all of those things so that we actually stop people being evicted in the first place, and also helping those people that are victims of domestic violence who feel that their only choice is to flee, where actually what we can support is get model support in and non-molestation orders and occupation orders to move the abuser out of the property that would leave that household safe. So yes, lots and lots for me to do in 6 months and week 1, but I'm on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in fact, that touches on a very important point, is of course the Renters Reform Bill, which has already been mentioned. And I think that's an interesting one. And you know, in general, I'm supportive of it. I fully appreciate that there's still quite a bit of work to be done on that piece of legislation. But bearing in mind that's going to stop the no-fault evictions from private landlords, which of course is a challenging area where the private sector housing team had seen a number of evictions take place whereby a tenant had made a complaint about a landlord not carrying out their duties correctly, and then the landlords were then enacting that no-fault eviction just to get rid of the tenant, almost as a punishment for them reporting that. And I understand that around about 20% of the homelessness approaches that we get are as a result of no-fault evictions. So we may therefore potentially see a reduction in those number of approaches, which will be interesting to see. Just a comment, this is to Councillor Mercer. One of the things I forgot to mention earlier on as well was the fact that one of the points that you raised was around what we do to work with tenants with regards to rent arrears. One of the things there that I should have mentioned is the fact that the Housing Income Management Policy was introduced in July 2022. So that's a little bit of bedtime reading if you're interested in reading some more, because it does talk about the focus that the policy is very orientated around working with tenants to deal with any rent arrears rather than going through the motions of evicting and punishing, etc. So
the best way.
Yeah, so it is an interesting read. So it's always worth just having a little look if you do get the opportunity. On the housing backlog figure that was contained within the presentation, this is not necessarily for answering today, Yvonne, but you may want to just go away and just double check that. It's just because it's slightly different to a figure that I have. The starting figure is listed as 5532 on the slides. However, I've got a figure just slightly different to that, and whether a couple of the numbers have become mixed up, because I have 5352 as the starting figure from the 1st of March. So it might just be worth taking that away and double checking. I do have a question also on the housing backlog of repairs. We decided that we were going to start with the left behind areas. I know that we certainly started with Kingswood and Hazelleys in Corby, but I just wanted to seek clarification that the Avondale Grange in Kettering was then also worked on and has been completed as another left behind area which falls within our HRA. And I also would just like to know whether comms has been going out to residents to give them notice that we would be going out to carry out their repairs, so that we were reducing the number of potential failed visits by letting them know that we were going to be in that area. On the same theme as well, I know it's been mentioned about the target, and are we on track? Now, I know previously we were roughly on track earlier in the year. There does seem to be some slight slippage, and I know you have already mentioned this, but I just wanted to seek some assurance, I suppose, that how confident are you that we will be able to complete this within the financial year, bearing in mind what's been done budget-wise? And the last time I saw figures, the work was being carried out way, way below the budget that had been allocated to it. Of course, that may have changed because sometimes we end up going to a job and, as you said, they become far more complex. But I wanted to see, are we potentially, do we need to be prepared for the fact that there is going to be some overspill into the next year for this backlog, and if so, do we feel that we're able to mitigate that with the budgets? Are we able to roll it over? As that's all on really that one topic, I'll leave that there, and I'm sorry, I do still have more.
So just in terms of the rollover, we will roll over into the next financial year, because just of when we started, we had a 12-month programme. So it will roll over into March, April of next year, just the logistics of that. Will we complete? I'm confident that we will. We have slippage, but it's 2%. And that some of that is around, residents not being in, or we having, different opportunities, or depending what the skill is. So I think we're very much close to a target. And obviously, sometimes in the Christmas times when we try to get in when people are more at home than not. And over that period of time, we would have had the summer holidays where some people aren't necessarily in. So it's something, as you'll be aware, we're monitoring on a weekly basis. So yes, we will hit our target, and it will move us into the next financial because of where we started. We have had some underspend in terms of that, but it does mean we can do some additional jobs and some additional work to be able to do that. I don't believe we're going to be in a position of coming back and asking you for any more funding in relation to the backlog programme, and then looking at making sure we're fully resourced to ensure that we can deliver the repairs ongoing after the backlog repairs programme concludes. I think that was it. Oh, Avondale, yes, we are putting communication out to residents, but I will need to check whether Avondale and where Avondale is on there. So if you give me the liberty of just coming back to you on that one, Councillor Binley. Thank you.
The one other question was about the left behind area, Avondale Grange, whether we completed that.
Yeah, so that one I don't know, so I will need to check with that and come back to you. So, but I am confident we are contacting residents in advance of us attending sites. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think if we're realistic, we'll never get 100% potentially complete. In any case, it was quite a tall ask, but we're always going to have people, like you rightly say, who are away or they're unavailable because of work, etc. So you've had some challenges, especially since you started with the authority. Of course, we've had the prominence of mould and mildew within properties. And then, of course, we've had RAC as well as a new issue. I'm interested to know where we are with mould, albeit I fully appreciate that is one which is a forever moving figure, especially as we come into seasons like now with the rain, etc., that we will again undoubtedly see that's creeping back up. But I'm just interested to seek some assurances that the measures that we put in place as an authority to address mould issues as robustly and as quickly as possible has been taking place, and that, for example, we do not have any mould issues outstanding for any long duration because of the risks that we know to people's health. So I'm just seeking some assurance there that, for example, we haven't got mould jobs that have been outstanding for months and months and months, and that we've got that constant churn, and we are getting on top of them as quickly as possible. And on the RAC front, I'm just interested to know whether there is any risk to our any of our stock with regards to RAC, and if there is, what measures have been taken. Those are two quite expansive subjects, so I'll let you answer that first of all.
So just in terms of RAC, we have done initial inspection, identification of properties that we believe that may be at risk. We don't feel we have any at risk, and I know there's a wider investigation going on for the wider corporate policies, so I feel that we're quite confident that we're not at any risk in terms of RAC, and we've also looked at the schools and other issues, so you're aware that that's happened. Just in terms of mould and damp, you're aware that we are undertaking weekly monitoring of our damp and mould cases. I can't give you the exact figure. I don't have that to hand because I can't tell you how many have been extending a month or two. But by their very nature, mould comes back. So you may find that when we have what we believe has been done a treatment, there may be another reason that that has come back. And we may have to go back to a property and it takes a course of treatment. So whilst you may have damp in January, the treatment may not finish until June. And so while you may say that's 6 months, that's actually what the normal course of treatment is. We will see an increase in damp because it's getting wet again. And a lot of that is also about us working with our residents to educate in terms of managing our properties. But right at the beginning of my presentation, I told you that a lot of our stock was 1945 and 1960-ish. It wasn't necessarily designed for the way we live now, or the radiators, or the different type of ventilation or watering heating that we put in. So as well as managing the damp and the mould, we need to look at our ongoing asset management and stock condition survey to make sure that we are looking at replacing windows, heating systems, and all of those things to make those properties as compliant. But as soon as we are aware of a damp and mould issue, we are going out, we are prioritising that, not only because it's the right thing to do, that it's part of the compliance, and is all part of the new legislation that's coming through, made more of a higher priority in the sad death of the young boy. So yes, we are prioritising damp, as we do with all of the compliance responsibilities that we have within the housing service.
The number of damp was mid-60s last week.
Which is brilliant.
Yeah, which is a hell of a lot down from 89 when the reporting started.
Yeah, so it has come down. I think you're quite right. We were in the 90s. We were around the 66. Some of those are ongoing maintenance. We may see an increase, I think, over the winter period, but we are on a trajectory of reducing that. And we report weekly to our lead member, the chief exec, and the leader in terms of our management of damp. And we're also talking to other companies who may be able to help us with more extensive damp work or provide us more insight. And also when we're buying and building new properties and purchasing, we are looking at that as an issue as well. Often some of the properties we buy back could have a damp issue. We need to be aware of why and what that is.
Okay. Your last questions, by the looks of it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I've only got a couple more. So, voids. I was interested to see the slide on the fact that there's some really progressive inroads being made into that and to reduce that figure. And I know that was absolutely also a key priority for you, because I suppose there's a twofold benefit to that in. At least that I can see. First of all, the rental income coming into the local authority, but of course, secondly, and more importantly, the fact that it affords the opportunity for residents to actually have access to that social housing. I just wondered on that front whether there was anything or any plans for any sort of void strategy or anything to be developed in the background. I did also have a question about the figure up there, whether that was all voids or whether that was just standard or major voids, just to clarify. And then it's already been touched on, but of course the social housing regulator and the tenancy satisfaction surveys. I just wanted to make sure we've got until 31st of March to get that out and get the results back, and I'm just interested to know whether that's on track to go out, because I know that normally around this time of year also there's the plan for a tenant newsletter to go out. And in fact, that was one of the things that was raised earlier. How do we engage with tenants? Well, that's one of the other things that happens, is the fact that a tenant's newsletter goes out. And I wondered whether the tenancy satisfaction surveys would be going out with a newsletter, or whether it would be done separately. And you'll be pleased to know, Yvonne, that's everything from me.
Thank you. So in terms of the newsletter, that will go out January. And in that publication, there will be notification to residents about the survey. So it will be encouraging people to complete the survey and advise why it is important that we have that information, and we welcome your insights. So we've tried to triangulate those both together. Just in terms of voids, in terms of a strategy, we now have a weekly voids meeting that looks at all of our voids, but within that meeting, it's not only the repairs team, but it's the housing management team and the allocations team. So we can understand when somebody has served us a notice, when are we going to get that property back? Who is on the waiting list with that need? Who should we start making offers to? Who can we safely start to do the viewings with? What is the work and the repair that needs to happen? Is it a minor void? So to answer your question, those were standard voids that were on that, not on major voids. And if it is a major void, why we pull it out? I'm also looking at additional budget to blitz our major voids. So these are long-standing voids that may need bathrooms, kitchens ripping out, extensions have been built on, illegally, all of those things. So we're looking at bringing in a team. But I think hopefully you've seen since my 6 months that is coming down. It was always a priority for me, because a void is a home that someone in need isn't in, and also it's a home that we're not getting rental income in. So that is a priority on there. And I'm reconfiguring how the major team works. It's been Joe Perry and Dan Hannum, Mark Jackson and Jerry Miller. I need to give, a real good shout out to the work that they are doing in terms of keeping this as a primary focus for us. So is it a strategy, not a written strategy? Is it an operational working practice priority? Absolutely, yes. I'd like to give you that guarantee on there. And also, one of the things we're also going to be doing is we're going to be bringing back our tenancy audits, because we are getting a lot of properties that are coming back in a really poor standard, and we need to understand why that is. Is it damage? Is it neglect? Should we have been speaking to that resident about why they are possibly struggling? Did they need to move to more alternative suitable accommodation? Should we be encouraging people to move to smaller, more suitable accommodation, which frees up a larger family home for people? So it's not just about the void, it's that wider trajectory look at how we do things and getting into those properties. So the newsletter as well will advise people that we will start to be bringing back our tenancy audits over a three-year period to have a look at some of those standards. And as I say, for those residents willfully damaging our property, we need to take a much more robust and fair stance on those who are doing that to our properties.
Okay, looks like everyone's raised all the questions. Thanks, Yvonne. Informative as ever. Okay, moving on to the next item then. The executive forward plan.
Thank you very much. So, members, item number 4, as you can see, you have got a copy of the executive forward plan for November 2023 to February 2024. I'm interested to know the thoughts of any that members may have as to whether there are any items there specifically that they wish to come to the EAP beforehand, before they go to executive. Of course, please note that 16th of November is come and gone, as those papers will be published at some point today, I believe.
If this meeting ever ends, Chair, then it will be so.
Take your hint. Thank you very much, David. Yes, if there are any items, of course, please make sure it's from November onwards. And of course, apologies. I know that our last meeting was cancelled because a number of the items, they end up going to one of the other EAPs with regards to environmental issues, rather than to this EAP, and bearing in mind its remit. So if there are any things that you would like to discuss, please do give me a wave, and we'll happily consider adding that on.
Through you, Chair. The Executive Forward Plan, as published, is a snapshot on the day it was published. So some of the dates for some of the items may have changed. I know within 15 minutes of publishing this, one of the items had already slipped by a month. So if there are any items on there, I'll be able to tell you the exact date that they're due to go to. Because once it's published, that is it. There is the internal forward plan, which is a much more fluid and accurate representation of the dates that the items are due to go to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Graham.
there aren't that many actually on here for the two of you, but there's 2 asset ones in December. I don't know if they're the ones that are slipped. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in the KLV business case, which KLV, the Kettering Leisure Village, which is due in January, though I don't know whether that's... so they're my submissions.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lorman. So are you proposing that we look at the asset acquisition policy and the surplus asset disposal, 2 items, and have those come before EAP? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So, David, if those could perhaps be flagged up to Graham Kane and Jonathan Waterworth for those 2.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. They're both currently still down on the internal forward plan for the 21st of December meeting.
Great, thank you ever so much. Yeah, I'll come to you just a second, Councillor Mercer. And sorry, KLV. So KLV, yes, I'm aware that, of course, that's due to go to executive in the early part of 2024. Of course, that will go to scrutiny beforehand as per the motion at full council. So I think that will be discussed at scrutiny. Whether we feel that it's relevant to come to here after scrutiny or before scrutiny, of course, that's...
Perhaps a joint meeting?
That's a possibility. Yeah, it's a real possibility to have scrutiny and the EAP look at it, because it would be relevant to do so, and that is the function of the EAP. I suppose my question there would be as to whether it's this EAP or whether it would end up being Councillor Howe's EAP is another question due to the crossover. So again, David, perhaps if that's one that you could take away.
Yes, back to the previous one though, it's worth mentioning that your next meeting of this EAP isn't until the 24th of January, by which point your 2 other items will have been considered and hopefully approved.
Right, okay. Yeah, with the forward plan, that doesn't give us a lot of time really to discuss these things. That might be one for us to pick up offline and see as to whether we, bearing in mind we have had a cancellation of an EAP, as to whether we wish to schedule a further EAP for the early part of December.
It's probably also worth noting that given the timescales involved in the production of executive reports, the draft report for December's meeting would be ready middle of November, so probably next week-ish. And it would be due for submission on the 23rd of this month.
Okay, so I think if we pick that up offline and have a little look, but at the moment then, Councillor Lorman, it's probably looking unlikely with the timescales that that's something that could be discussed beforehand. It would probably have to be sort of January onwards. We need to be truthfully, as an EAP, looking far further into the future with regards to these items, and unfortunately I think that's part of the fact that we did cancel the last meeting due to a lack of items, and really we should have, of course, as a result, looked at the forward plan. So yeah, I think from a practicality perspective that's probably going to be unlikely, but I think, you know, we can of course then have a look at the potential of having a joint KLV discussion that can be picked up.
Yeah, I can certainly look at that for you, Chair. Also, if it would be of use to members, I've got some work to do on the internal forward plan once I've dealt with executive today. And then I could send a copy of the internal forward plan to members, which it goes right up to March. I think we've got items as far as March and April on there at the moment, so then you can pick the bones out of that offline and come back to us with an informed idea of what you might want to add to the forward plan for this EAP going forwards.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. And Councillor Mercer.
Thank you, Chair. The thing that, well, there's a number of issues there that I'm interested in, but has been pointed out, we've passed the deadline for most of them. There's one issue, though, that is going to, I'm afraid, continue to be active for some considerable time and will come back in many shapes and forms, and that is the business plan of the Northamptonshire Children's Trust. I, for one, do not think that they will get their deficit down to zero in the foreseeable future, and as a result, I feel that it will be a live topic for quite some time and will need a lot of how can I put it, inventive thinking to deal with. There is an issue there that is fundamental, namely that that body has the right to spend whatever they like, and this council has to pick up the tab, and it is squeezing other budgets and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. So that is something which is a genuine, legitimate topic for an EAP to look at. I don't know which EAP it should be. That's a different issue. But I feel that it should be something that is discussed in almost a blue sky point of view to try and figure out how it can be brought under control. It's the overspending of children's services when I was on the county council was a major problem and contributed significantly to the financial problems at the county council, and we're seeing it replicated with the Children's Trust, but with less oversight by councillors than we had even at the county. So that will have to come, or should come, to some sort of EAP. I just don't know which one and when.
Fortunately, Councillor Mercer, that will not be this EAP. It would end up being Councillor Edwards because of the element of children's services in there. And of course, scrutiny also have the opportunity to ask those questions. And I'm also aware that audit and governance are very, very robustly discussing some of the issues there with the Children's Trust. But I think you're right to raise those concerns, because it is something that we should all be concerned about as elected members, and the impact that it has on us and our budgets overall. So on that note, are there any other points, Councillor Lorman?
Yeah, well, sort of picking it up on a wider point, we need to have a discussion how the EAPs and scrutiny are going to work, because we don't want people having to report to both within a couple of weeks. And as I said earlier, the point of the EAPs, I understood, was that they would be advice givers to executive and formulating policy and how things might be done. So I wonder whether it might be a better way to look at it for the executive members to think what's further than 6 months ahead, and that the officers are writing policies, strategies, whatever, that could be discussed at an early stage. I could think of things like the local transport plan, for instance, which is maybe some way off, but is vital and reaches into everybody's purview. So, and there will be others, the highways maintenance plan, and all sorts of bits and pieces. It may be to work the other way around, for executive to just think in good time before the papers are starting to be written what might come for discussion.
Yeah, just to come back on that, Councillor Lorman, I think you're absolutely right. It's twofold, though. It's about discussing policies before they're shaped, but it's also about discussing policies as they are being shaped as well. So it's a combination of the above. You are correct. So you putting your hand up, Kojak?
Yeah, a couple that, well, one that I've seen that I'd like to get some input from this EAP is the draft homeless and rough sleeper strategy, which we might be able to fit in because that's due February. So we could possibly put that in January. He said, hopefully.
I've got a feeling, through you, Chair, that might have slipped to March, so you might have even more time to deal with it.
Yeah, and the other one obviously is the housing strategy that Yvonne's building. Would be ideal to bring that forward. That should be at a state in January as well.
Thank you very much. Right, I think in that case then we'll move on to item 5, which of course is just the forward plan, which is what we've been discussing really, and about adding some items onto that, because at the moment we have a rather bare plan from our side of things. Of course, we do have some bits in there for January, but apart from that, that is it. So hence why we need to go away and have a little think about what else needs to be added to that. So unless there are any comments on the forward plan for the EAP.
Through you, Chair. There was an item that was originally on the forward plan, I think, at the May meeting that was scheduled for this meeting that seems to have dropped off. It's sort of resurfaced in the last couple of days. It's from Amy Plank. I'm trying to find the exact title for it now. Bear with me. Oh, private sector housing policy. That was it. Looking at January time for that as well, if you wanted to add that on.
Yeah, I think that would be good, David, yeah.
So you'd have private sector housing policy, you'd have a street trading policy that I think I spotted on the
Yes,
forward
you
plan.
did.
Yeah. And then we'll see what else we can get out of the other suggestions that you've made.
Okay, that's great. Thank you ever so much. Right, in that case, thank you all very much for your participation. I appreciate it's been quite a long and interesting discussion on housing, but bring the meeting to a close. Thank you.